Well, we've got big tech on the docket again today because this seems to be the topic du jour, both in the White House and on Capitol Hill. President Trump has summoned Republican lawmakers, political strategists, and social media stars to the White House tomorrow to begin discussing opportunities and challenges for the web. But his upcoming summit, according to some critics, could end up empowering online provocateurs who have adopted controversial tactics entering the 2020 campaign. This is going to be a high-profile gathering following a number of attacks from Trump claiming that Facebook, Google, and Twitter, all services that the president uses to talk to his supporters, secretly censor right-leaning users' website and content. Now, this charge of political bias that the tech giants strongly deny is hard to back away from. There are a number of our listeners here who share things on social media who themselves have experienced censorship. I know myself, I have indeed been censored on Twitter for politically incorrect speech, and no one understands better this political and tech landscape than my next guest, who will join me to talk about White House summit discussions tomorrow. I have Rob Bluey, executive editor of the Daily Signal at the Heritage Foundation, and I'm glad to talk to him. Rob, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be with you.
So I understand that President Trump has not invited any of the major tech companies. So Alphabet, Google, YouTube, Facebook will not be in attendance tomorrow. Do you think that there's a particular message that the president is trying to send in his denial of attendance for these organizations?
Well, it's interesting because certainly conservatives have had opportunities to interact with these companies in the past. The president has met with the head of Google in the past as well. So it's not that he's not talking to them. I think, though, that the president wants to have more of a family discussion at the social media summit, and he probably figures that bringing them into the equation, bringing them into the meeting might be less productive than just talking to conservatives directly about his concerns on social media. I certainly don't think it sends a signal that he's not willing to engage in a conversation, though.
So who will be in attendance tomorrow during the summit?
Sure. It's really an eclectic mix of people. There are digital strategists such as myself who work for organizations like the Heritage Foundation and Daily Signal, as well as people like Brent Bozell from the Media Research Center. There are also some people who are outside of the Beltway who are in their own right social media stars, people who have enormous Twitter followings and have been able to really cultivate a following based on their advocacy and maybe some of the controversial things they've said. One of the things that I think will be interesting to hear tomorrow are some of those personal examples. You mentioned yourself being subject to some censorship. We faced it here at the Heritage Foundation and Daily Signal, and if I have the opportunity, I'd love to share with the president some of the times that we found ourselves in hot water. Usually, by the way, it comes down to issues related to, abortion, same-sex marriage, transgender issues, those types of things that it seems that the tech companies consider hate speech when we consider, in many cases, just using common sense about how we're talking about policy issues.
Exactly. And they are what are considered hot-button political issues, although for many, many years, these were not issues that I think anyone would consider to be highly controversial. And instead, many of us are just relying on deeply held religious beliefs or political perspectives, not to actually eschew the viewpoints of other people, but really to share how we feel about issues that are very much in the public discourse. Our opinions just happen to be unpopular ones on those issues. Well, Judd Deere, who is White House spokesman, explained that the administration has opted to convene the event after hearing from thousands of Americans. And for a very brief period of time, the White House had actually opened up an online portal to submit comments on those who had censorship experiences online. And he said specifically that thousands of Americans across the spectrum had responded and said that Trump, quote, wants to engage directly with these digital leaders in a discussion on the power of social media, end quote. So really, Trump, again, not ever being one to mince words, has also, through his spokesperson, said the exact same thing. During this recent interview he had on Fox, the president even charged that Google likes to rig upcoming elections. So to say that Google has a vested interest in the outcome of an election, understanding the discussion for so long on the nature of, for example, Russian involvement in past political elections, that term meddling or rigging is a highly charged one. So do you think that's a fair assessment on the president's part?
Well, I think the president, yes, has a right to be concerned. I mean, we know that these social media companies have enormous power in terms of the algorithms that they control, and in the case of Google, what search results we ultimately see. Now, I think that in some cases, yes, he might exaggerate the situation, but I also think that we've all experienced firsthand some of the consequences when we say unpopular things that these tech companies don't like. Let's face it wasn't too long ago that our own president of the Heritage Foundation, Kay Coles-James, was invited by Google to sit on a board which dealt with artificial intelligence, an advisory board. Google, facing pressure from its own internal staff, decided that it was easier to scrap the board because they didn't want somebody on that review board who held the socially conservative views that she did. So we know that the people who work for these companies probably lean to the left. I think the big question, though, coming out of tomorrow's meeting is, what are some of the solutions that we can work toward? I mean, I'm personally in favor of putting public pressure, putting market pressure on these companies and trying to get them to change that way. I know that there are other conservatives who would like to see a government solution. Frankly, I'm not confident the government can solve this problem, and I'd hate to see what somebody after Trump leaves the White House would in some cases do if the government were in control. I mean, they probably would be biased even worse against conservatives.
This is sort of a situation where everybody seems to identify the problem but can't come up with a unified solution to the problem.
Right.
And there are viable perspectives on both sides. There are free market conservatives who don't want any involvement whatsoever from a regulatory standpoint. There are other people who think antitrust is the way to go when Facebook, for example, holds a 92% market share. And then there are other people who are approaching this from a market standpoint and specifically from a constitutional development of a free speech charter, for example. And I know there is now much talk in Washington about changes to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. One of the premier pieces of legislation, that particular bill that covers these tech platforms with immunity. So there are lots of different perspectives on this, but not entirely clear which one is going to come out in the end as the most successful. Are you individually sort of leaning toward one perspective or another as to how to solve what has become a monolithic problem?
Well, personally, and also in terms of a free market perspective, which I particularly hold, I don't want to see the government involved, whether it is antitrust or whether it's amending Section 230. I know that there are conservatives out there who believe that those are the right paths. I would like to see conservatives band together and apply that market pressure in order to force these companies to change. We've already seen them start to change, by the way. I mean, 2 years ago, these companies rarely employed anybody who was conservative. Now there are representatives in Washington who conservative organizations like the Heritage Foundation can turn to when we encounter problems. We had a video that we posted of a pediatrician warning about the dangers of puberty blockers for young children that Facebook pulled off its website after it had attracted 70 million views. It really took some public market pressure for us to do that. I'm not sure a government entity would have been the solution in that case. And so I think these are going to be the debates that we hear tomorrow. The president is expected to make some comments. There's also going to be at least a couple of lawmakers in attendance. Matt Gaetz, and who's a Florida congressman, and Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee will be there. They've experienced their own censorship, so it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say as well.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up in the couple of minutes that we have here. That's such a perfect picture of how not only this affects nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, private individuals, but how it has also ultimately changed the political landscape. Trump himself has approximately 61 million followers on Twitter. So we also recognize that this, for him, particularly going into another election season, could be a consequential summit from the standpoint that solutions here may or may not determine what he is able to do in the future.
That's right. And look, I'm so glad you made that point, because I think this is one of the reasons that Trump is actually in the White House today, is he was able to take his message directly to the American people through platforms like Twitter. We even see his campaign now leveraging Google and Facebook as advertising platforms to reach potential voters, new voters, people who may have traditionally supported Democrats in the past, but because of his savvy marketing skills, the president has been able to win them over to his cause. So in many ways, the Trump campaign, the Trump administration has been able to effectively leverage these social media platforms for its own use. So there's a stake that he has in this personally. He certainly doesn't want to have his information or message suppressed. But I also think conservatives broadly have benefited from social media. I mean, look, it's given us an opportunity to go around the mainstream national news media to get our message out, much like we're doing on this radio program now. So,
right.
I mean, there are so many different benefits that we have to these programs, and that's why I think it's really important that we band together and we really put pressure on them not to make changes to the algorithms and other means that might harm that ability to get the message out.
Well, everybody from Prager University and Project Veritas Media Research Center and the Heritage Foundation will be in attendance tomorrow. And Rob Bluey has been my excellent guest, executive editor, The Daily Signal, who will be present tomorrow as well. And we'll be following up to see what his impressions are after the summit.